Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
We are family. I got all my sisters with me.
Yeah. Feel free to join in. Thanks for letting me hang out there. Appreciate that. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about family, and my sister's with me, Alyssa Lockhart here, partner at McQuarrie Hunter, and just upgraded senior associate, Leah Donaldson from the Wilson Estates division. So we're loosening up a little now. We're getting into it. Now we get into the serious stuff, which is when somebody's divorced, they remarry, 2 sets of kids. Now you have money from one marriage and a second marriage, and it already sounds complicated. So we could go at this so many different ways. Give us a sort of a generic look at that and how you have to deal with it.
Well, it's hard for me when I meet with clients to give a generic look. So I'll just do what I do with my clients.
Right.
I have 3 children. One is from a prior relationship, but she's being raised by my current spouse, and she calls him dad and has known him since she was 2.5, 3 years old. So how I look at it is, my children are all young and at home, and if something happened to me, she loves her biological family, but she would probably stay at home with her dad and her sisters to finish high school. So she would stay in the family unit, and he would continue to raise her, and then ultimately, he is younger than me. He would probably decide to remarry at some point.
No. He would.
It would be hard to get over me, I can appreciate, but at some point, I don't know if he could handle it on his own. So say he remarries, and maybe he remarries somebody younger. Maybe he has additional children. Maybe she comes with children of her own.
He's busy.
He's a busy boy at that point, yeah. So 20 years go by. Maybe my oldest daughter doesn't like the stepmother very much. Maybe she's moved away to college and the relationship just somewhat cooled. She sees her sisters, who have also moved away from home in their adult years, on her own without seeing him. When he looks at his estate plan with his second wife, does his second wife say, honey, what should we do with all of Alyssa's assets when we die? Or 20 years after my death, does she say, hey, what should we do with our assets when we die?
Which is pretty common. Exactly. They've been living together for many years.
She's been the custodian of the assets. She feels a proprietary entitlement to them. She's grown them perhaps or been spending them.
Second wives will do that, right?
Exactly. So not always. I mean, sometimes they bring more to the table than we give everybody credit for. But what we're really concerned with is, when my husband passes away, will my oldest daughter have a claim against his estate if he simply cuts her out? So if I put all of my faith in him and I say, I want to split my assets when we both have passed away equally between our 3 children, and he says, of course I do too, will that stand the test of time? And if it doesn't, will she have a claim? And the answer is no.
None.
No. Stepchildren do not have a claim. And so there are a number of steps we can take. None of them fall within the bounds of that simple will.
Okay, so what would somebody in that situation do to protect that child?
Right. So, for instance, I might leave an asset directly to that child in my current will, and I might say in my husband's will that if he dies following me, that asset that she already received from me, because he still does plan to leave all of the assets equally between the 3 girls, that gift that she received early on from my passing will be what we call hodgepotted.
Hodgepotted.
I know, I love the word too. Other lawyers often ask me about the word hodgepodge, so it's kind of the time to be, the cool lawyer, even though I'm in Wilson Estates. Hodgepotted simply means to bring into account. So rather than doubling up on her gift and she gets that extra money and rides off into the sunset, she shares it equally also as between 3.
So it kind of comes back in at that point and is added in.
And then is divided again as of 3.
Now, if say from your first marriage you had a condo in downtown Vancouver that you had willed directly to that child,
right.
And that had gone up $1 million. It's not unfathomable to think that in those many years. So her asset, does it go in at the value it is today? Or does it go into the value that she received it?
You know, that's a very good question, because there you've drawn in an asset from the prior relationship, not necessarily of my own doing or growth. So then I would have to consider whether that asset was segregated for her and created outside of this second family that I've had, and whether I even want to do an adjustment. There's no absolute requirement that we give 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 to our children. So I might say, you know what, it's unfortunate that that relationship created an asset that these other two won't share in, but morally I feel obligated to my first husband to share that only with his offspring. Or maybe in my separation and divorce agreement, there's some kind of clause that requires that.
But if you didn't make that adjustment and it would got hodgepodge, what is it?
Well, hodgepodge.
Hodgepodge.
It would only be hodgepodged if I wanted it to be.
Ah.
Right?
Okay.
So when we're asking about as between the assets that my current husband and I have, if I did protect that first daughter by making sure she at least gets something, whether or not he later provides for her or forgets her, then we can hodgepodge to make sure that she doesn't get something more as between the three equally. But we might want to treat our children not within inequity.
Mm-hmm.
The difficulty for the oldest daughter in that scenario too is that if it is Alyssa's situation on her death, that child has to make a decision at that point based on what Alyssa's will says at that time. If it says it's all going to her husband, she has to make a decision at that point. Do I wait, trust, and hope that this new person that he might end up marrying is going to take me into account? Or do I have to make that claim now because the only person's estate I can seek against is my biological parents?
You can't go back.
No.
Not 20 years later, no.
And so what's the advice to that individual?
Well, that's what we're saying is that if Alyssa's will reflects that and takes that into account and there's proper estate planning, she doesn't need to make that decision. She knows she's accounted for.
And I think that one of the other challenges there is she's 16 right now. She's a minor. If I did pass, I don't think it would be her decision to make. She would have a guardian, and that guardian would have an obligation to protect her and an obligation to sue. And that's really what we're getting at. It's not just the money, it's the relationship.
Okay,
that relationship gets destroyed.
But back to my point that 20 years passes and that the value of that condo has gone up from $200,000 to $1 million, for example, and then it goes back in and is hodgepodged. And it's split three ways, for example. Is it split on the value that when she got it at $200,000 or the $1 million?
You know, it's generally split on the time when the gift was made. So if she received something from me, she might have sold that condo and spent it on handbags.
I've seen
knowing
those,
this one daughter, right?
I've seen those people around town.
Exactly.
With a little dog in it on Robson Street.
However, what if I left her $200,000 or $500,000 and she used it to acquire a condo, which she then grew? So we're really talking about the gift as at the time she received
That's
it.
what I'm curious about, So it's at the time you received it.
Absolutely.
Okay, very interesting. All right, so that's one scenario. That now you have another marriage or, how far can you protect a child? Like, what are the limitations? Like, can the second or third wife say, well, we've been married for 40 years. Does this person really have that much of a claim? This is a long time ago. It's an adult.
I think Leah will have a lot to say about that. But just before we get to the litigation, because that's a really good litigation answer, I think one of the things that I like to see if we do own property is I might sever the tenancies between myself and my husband. We won't necessarily hold our home in a jointure. I'll hold my half as a tenant in common and leave him a life interest. And he can use that asset, he can live in it, we could sell it, he could buy a replacement property, but that life interest will always be held on the ultimate trust that my children will share in my half equally upon his death or his incapacity, permanent incapacity, whenever he ceases using the asset. So we can go indefinitely to protect our children. We just need to know that those tools are available to us, and the will doesn't look any more complicated at the end of the day. It just has the right language in it. But it is a litigation answer.
Yeah. So a lot of litigation springs from that. And I would just say that one thing to keep in mind is that people don't have any obligation to say what's in their will. So, you can anticipate and guess what might happen, but a person can change their will at any time. And so when we see the blended family scenario, unless it's taken into account, that child is left to sort of guess what's happening down the road. In terms of litigation as between different claimants, we see, it's very fact specific. So when we have minor children that are left behind, they're basically looked after first. A spouse is also very important. We do see adult children. Sometimes they have disabilities or financial needs that are greater than others. So those are all factors that are taken into account. And that's just one piece of estate litigation, which is wills variation, which is part of WESA.
We could do whole shows on this, just on the blended family. There's so many ways. I'm sure there's lots of people like, well, what about this? When they're in their car right now listening to it. I have this situation.
We could do entire family get-togethers where nobody speaks but us.
Those are awkward meetings, aren't they? So now... Leah, you're at the sort of pointy end of the sword here. You see the worst of what's happening, right?
I do.
So I kind of just look at this in my own experience with not my age group, but my dad's fighting with his brothers. This is the kind of the biggest rift that can happen in a family. He's fighting over the estate. It
is. It's second, I would say, to a divorce, but it's up there. And that is because there's a lot of dynamics going on in families over the years, and you'd be surprised the history that gets pulled in.
People bring back stories from...
from childhood.
Really?
50-year-old litigants are focused on, what's happening when they were 10 and their relationships with their parents, their relationships with their siblings. That all informs litigation. And so it's something that definitely needs to be taken into account. And
do you see similar traits in people over the years? Like you go, this is the grumpy bear, this is the happy camper. Like
I like to, when I meet with families, is guess the birth order, and I'm pretty good at it.
Oh, really?
About now, yeah.
Okay, quickly.
After several years, I'm like, you're the oldest.
So quickly, what is the oldest all about?
The oldest is always the sort of overachieving, usually type A, more often than not.
All right, the middle child?
Responsible. The middle child is harder, but the baby is also easy usually to pick out.
Because they're the
baby,
yeah, right.
And it's pretty clear. And maybe that my answer is formed by the fact that I am a middle child. So notice I have definitions for the other two.
All right.
Middle child is always wonderful.
Exactly.
When we come back, we're going to get into what is an executor, what is the role, the timelines, the pitfalls, and more on The Law Show.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.